The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Welcome to International Insights. I am Doug Davis, and with me is Michael Slobodchikoff. On this episode, we'll be speaking with D.T. Max. Mr. Max graduated from Harvard and has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2010. He has multiple books, including The Family That Couldn't Sleep, A Medical Mystery, Finale, Late Conversations with Stephen Sondheim. We're going to devote this program to his work on the great American writer, David Foster Wallace, and Mr. Max's book, Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, A Life of David Foster Wallace. Mr. Max, welcome to the program from Long Island.
Thanks for having me.
It is truly a pleasure to have you join us today. And you were able to write one of the first biographies on David Foster Wallace, which came after your New Yorker article. It was entitled, Every Love Story is a Ghost Story. So please tell us a little bit about what led you to offer this biography and why the book has the title that you've chosen.
Sure. I mean, actually, it's not only the first biography, it's the only biography. And that's true even though it's now been terrible mess. 17 years since his death. Well, first of all, the title is a little bit of a strange story, but let me first sort of tell you the process by which I came to write it. So, as you mentioned, I was assigned by the New Yorker to do a piece on David shortly after his death. But amazingly, it was not the first piece to be written. There was already a Rolling Stone piece that was almost done, because I think David's suicide was immediately struck, the people who have to sort of get these things as something they wanted. They knew readers would want to know more about them. And I should say, and I've always said, I was not, there are people in the world for whom, like, DFW, as he was called, was sort of an absolute obsession. I wasn't that person. I mean, I didn't have one of those super low party card numbers. I cared about him, but I cared about a lot of writers, and I found him challenging, and some of his stuff terrific, and some of his stuff a little bit harder. And it was really only in writing the New Yorker piece that I came to really, really get into his stuff in the way that friends of mine had always been into it. I can remember there was one writer, for instance, who, when he saw I was an editor at a magazine in that era when Infinite Jest, which is Wallace's great book, came out, and I think that's 95 or 96. Somebody has to check that. It's been a while since I wrote this book. But anyway, and he came in and he saw the copy of Infinite Jest on my shelf, and he grabbed it before I could even stop him and say I wanted to read it. So, but over over researching the New Yorker piece, which really focused on his suicide, which was then fresh, and his unfinished novel, which would eventually come out and be called The Pale King, although still not finished, I really began to understand I want to spend more time on him. Now, the New Yorker pieces take a while, and they're long. The piece was probably 8,000 or 9,000 words. The book is maybe 80 or 90, can be more. For an academic, 80 or 90 is maybe just, the introduction. But like, spend some time with the person already. So I wanted more. Now, to the actual question, which is about the title. So the title is as I look at the title now, I think to myself, what is that actually? It was meant to be kind of, I don't know quite what the word would be. It was meant to be alluring without being specific, but that makes it sound more thought through than it was. I was reading to his correspondence, which, by the way, I should say, does not mean you go to a university and you give them your, you fill out a form and they give you the correspondence. When somebody has just passed away, you got to find the correspondence, and it's in the hands of, the lovers and the friends and the editors. So I was reading through this correspondence with a colleague of his at University of Arizona, not a colleague, a teacher really at that point, named Richard Ellman.
Your book is now a decade old, and in looking back, what would you do differently? What would you give more emphasis to, and what would you give less attention to? And are there any interesting anecdotes that you have learned over the past 10 years that you would include in the work?
Well, so, that's a really interesting question in the case of Wallace. And I mean, there's a number of parts to it. So I don't know that I would do anything differently. I put everything I had into the biography. And, it was an interesting example of a book that in a certain way kind of pleased. Well, so, you write a biography, you throw out in the world. It's your version, your view. But, I'm very much a reporter writer. And so it was very much, an attempt to create this person who otherwise would have been lost. This isn't the second or third biography where a lot of what you're doing is the gloss. This is really taking someone who would be lost entirely if you didn't write about them and capturing them. So, there's a lot of things I didn't get, right? I mean, they're still not gotten. I mean, it's not 800 pages. There are doubtless, at meetings, at readings, I would often meet people who were in AA with David and who would tell me stories that I hadn't had before, but they didn't fundamentally change the story. And I don't think we really know much that we knew then. In fact, in a way, we know less because, in the past number of years, people have died who were his confidants, and that's what always happens. It was very lucky to have an opportunity to capture somebody when everyone around them is alive. Usually you do a biography of someone and they're, whatever, a certain age, and so their teachers are gone, but his teachers are still around. What did change is, David's kind of place in the culture, and I think radically, and it's still hard to know exactly what to say about that. I mean, so when I published the book, I thought of the book, I have to admit, I thought of the book as a borderline pathography, as Joyce Carol Oates called such books. And I was surprised to find it received really, I really thought I would be losing Wallace's hardcore, because, it shows a lot of the ugly side of David Foster Wallace. And, his behavior was often, inexcusable. But the story, on the other hand, also ends, I believed, I was writing it very much with this idea, that you create the life in full. So I didn't leave everything is in there. There's at one point he tries to buy a gun to kill the husband of his girlfriend. You really, it's all in there. But, at some point, and I think this was unique to David, the culture really began to say, like, this guy is untouchable. And I think the low point is that if you watch a very good movie called, I think, Promising Young Women, there's like a creepy guy who's like a David Foster Wallace enthusiast, and that's short for like creepy guy. So I didn't make any excuses for him. As a biographer, I sort of think you throw your boat on the water, you throw your book on the water, and the tides push it around. And I think in that sense, it stood up pretty well. I also think that, you write a book for the long haul, and the real question, which I cannot answer, is, will David be read 50 years from now? Well, I may not be liked. That's certainly a possibility. But will he be read? And there, I don't know. There's a very good journal of David Foster Wallace studies, for instance, that's published in Austin. I still run into plenty of young people who are sort of taking the book along for that classic, month in Nepal. But there's certainly a group of people who won't read him now. I think. I don't know how many. I mean, I don't know exactly the details, but and I think that's within their rights. I could see why they would feel that way. One of the curiosities for me is why they didn't feel that way after reading the biography. But it's just, you can't really influence as a biographer where your book lands. I mean, for what it's worth, I don't think the book was particularly liked in a certain sense by his family, for instance. You know, and I think that's kind of a sign that you've done your job properly. Is you can't I don't know, was Richard Ellman's biography liked by Joyce's family? The other Richard Ellman, I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
my guess is not, right? I mean, that's just not something that happens. It's not really something you have to make happen. So, in that sense, I'd be happy to have had a few more anecdotes. My view of him, I think I understood who he was pretty early on. I didn't know anything about him really as a person when I started writing the book, and I had never met him. But pretty early on, I think I understood that that he was a very depressed, very intense, young man who worked really hard to put the world together. I think he had a lot of anger in him. You know, I'm not a big user of like labels. So, for instance, the fact that he's depressed is only mentioned once, I think, by name in the entire biography. Although it's the matrix really through which all of it flows for anyone who's like, I think, familiar with depression. The other thing you should know is, I mean, since I stopped reporting it, you have to report to get information. So I didn't, at some point, I remember at some point somebody gave me a cache of letters, uh, and they were almost exactly like another cache of letters that I had had, and I thought that's when you know you're at a good place to stop your reporting.
No, that's great. Um, I would like to ask you about his reputation resting mainly on Infinite Jest, published in 1996 and set in a tennis academy and a rehab center. You've read this work multiple times. What, in your mind, makes this work different from other American literature, and what contribution does it make to American culture?
Those are probably questions that are above my pay grade in a certain sense. Every novel is different from other novels, and I can talk sort of more about why this book stuck out in 1996, or I think whenever people first started reading it. I mean, I think the most noticeable thing is if you can cast your mind back all those years, you remember that, first of all, we had just come out of a kind of minimalist period of fiction, with Raymond Carver being the exemplum. But fiction was really very, again, I'm speaking in huge swaths here. Fiction was very timid, and it was biting off little nibbles. And what was amazing about Infinite Jest was that it had this kind of courage to really imagine whole worlds. I don't think all of them is successful. I mean, some of the book always struck me as a little bit childish. Um, but and it also, I think, brilliantly captured a frustration that people my age, he and I were the same age, a frustration that people had with a world that seems so kind of laced with irony, um, that you couldn't really make a sincere expression. If you couldn't say anything sincerely or authentically, then how could you actually communicate? I think there's a quote from him. I can't remember, he's quoting someone else, where he says, "Irony is the sound of the prisoner rattling the cages of his bar, the bars of his cage." So cages of his bar would be a different problem. But anyway, I think that was really what notched for the book. Now, why is the book still read? Because, I mean, we've gone through a number of, I think, iterations of literary fashion, if that's really what we're talking about. And I think what clearly happened, I think David anticipated it, is that really identity politics became the way books were digested. Um, and his is the last era, again, I'm speaking in super wide swaths, I think, where that wasn't very much the focus of almost every review, every discussion. There's a moment that I narrate in every love story where he's at he's had a reading, and I can't remember who he's with, but I'll make it up and say it was Sherman Alexie and Juno Diaz or something, and the and the announcer says something indicating something about cultural politics, and identity politics, and David sort of sits up, takes his chair, and goes and places it on the edge of the stage because it's not something he can really speak to. So at this remove, so I do know people in their early 20s who take the book with them, and I do think they find the same. I think they find the same nourishment of this very pure world, this very intensely felt world, and this world is very, very discontent. It anticipates, even it just anticipates a lot of themes. And I should also add, many people, I believe, still start it and don't finish it, and then they go on to David's nonfiction, which is much more digestible, even though he wrote it kind of, with one hand tied behind his back. But a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again is, in a way, a kind of nonfiction distillation of just the things that I'm talking about. And he, I think that what they find in there also is an incredible disappointment with the world as it is. And I think that's probably something a lot of young people feel even more right now. It's a funny book because, you can say it anticipated, media saturation, but on the other hand, it was written in 1990 or early 90s, when there was plenty of media saturation already. I mean, I've always thought that slightly. I don't really think he was the first on that in any way, but I do think that he captured it with a weirdly, he was very interested. For instance, this will sound ancient, but and also kind of weirdly out of step with a lot of people's thinking right now, but he was very, very interested in David Letterman, who's the first of the ironic comedians, right? So who are we all talking about right now is Jimmy Kimmel, right? But in David's world, this shows how long ago we are. Letterman is sort of the Antichrist, and he's the Antichrist because he laces everything with irony. That may be exactly where people find sustenance in late night comedy at this point. A protective sheen over things that they are experiencing with horror. So there's been a lot of swings of the pendulum. I think the other interesting thing or problem, if you're David Foster Wallace, I think if we were like David Foster Wallace, still alive and wanting to be read, is that in the academic world, I think it's always been a little bit tricky how to teach him because Infinite Jest is too long for any class. So when I taught as a professor of journalism briefly, and I would do a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again, which I thought was extraordinarily teachable. And I did find that students really respond to the different tones of the prose and also the energy. I think the energy is really, really, really notches with readers. So when we ask, the only question that really matters, which is, will he be read? I think he will, and I think it's partially because he's not only he's sort of the last, and I think that period. I mean, there are people still writing big novels, but they feel very much like artifacts, and they get treated sort of like artifacts, and they get called big novel writers, and they get dismissed as big novel writers. So I think the sort of culture as a whole doesn't really want that anymore. It's pushing back against that kind of effort, finding it pretentious and growy, or there's a lot of different sort of words for it.
Infinite Jest is a very complex work, and I'd like to turn now to the work that he was writing as he died, The Pale King. And what do you think Wallace was proposing in this work, and what thoughts do you have on how it would have looked had he been able to complete it and not have it done by an editor?
Well, I mean, I think what he was, so he had I'm the biographer, so I know more about the life in a way and how it relates to the work. There'd be other people who would say that you can't relate the life to the work in quite such a, I think he has a lot of trouble finishing this book. The story of the biography end of the New Yorker piece is that he basically was stuck with his novel, and he had taken an antidepressant called Nardole for most of his adult life, and it had really kept him well enough to write. And he went off it trying, I think, to get a little bit more focused than he was able to get with Nardole. And then he couldn't stabilize himself, and he couldn't really find the right other medication. Nardole's kind of tough to metabolize. And eventually he despairs, and after several attempts, he does kill himself. I mean, it's an enormous tragedy. So the question is, okay, so he leaves The Pale King, this manuscript, a lot of pages. I've seen most of it, I believe, or maybe even all of it. And a lot of it's rewrites of rewrites of rewrites, which is weird because for Infinite Jest, there's almost no manuscript. So either it just worked or he destroyed them. But I just think early versions just congealed really early, really quickly and well. So he leaves these sort of lights in his garage on this manuscript, which is obviously like kind of a call for someone to do something about it. And Michael Peach, who was his very, very talented editor, did edit a book that came out and actually got, in a funny way, I think, better reviews than Infinite Jest. I was just looking back on the reviews of Infinite Jest, and the mainstream critics, Michiko Kakutani, most famously at the Times, was like, it's a mess. And then weirdly enough, Jay McInerney, who wrote Bright Lights, Big City, reviewed it for the New York Times Book Review and said, he had a very clever quote about, like, I forget exactly. But anyway, the main point was like the two pieces, because there's two threads in the book, we don't have time to get into it. But Doug can fill everyone in afterwards. Because it is a complex book, and I'm really not doing it even the remotest kind of justice. So with Pale King, I think he was writing out of the idea that he just couldn't figure out his stance before writing anymore. And so it's a story about a guy who has a job so boring as an IRS agent that he achieves a kind of transcendence through this boringness. And so it sets up an interesting problem as a writer. And the interesting problem as a writer is, which many writers have faced and some have solved, is how do you make boredom interesting, right? I mean, writing is not a one-for-one process. You can write a violent scene and not be, and your scene isn't, and the writing isn't going to hurt anyone. Like you're projecting symbols onto a page, and so it's doable. I think in a number of different ways, and the way he does it, and I think it's really the only way he knew how to do it, is he makes the writing interesting. So the writing is much more fluid and graceful, or even, some of his best writing is in The Pale King. I mean, for a certain kind of reader, The Pale King is way more palatable than Infinite Jest, which, Infinite Jest is really kind of like a young cult taken out into the field and allowed to run crazy, but it doesn't really cohere. I mean, the story as we have it, anyway, doesn't finish. There's large pieces of the plot that are missing, but you do feel. I mean, I don't dissuade people from reading them. I think you do feel something is going on there. I don't really know how he planned to finish the book. I mean, a piece of me sort of thinks he would have put it on the pile and started something like Old Man and the Sea, that like when you're stuck, just do something fast and clean, because it was complicated. It was multi-part, and I think he achieved a lot on the level of the sentence and the scene. Actually, there's some wonderful scenes in the book, but I don't know. I mean, Michael Peach would be better to estimate how much is missing from what would have been written. I really don't. No, for me, as the biographer, it was the pain of those years and the effort, and sitting down and over and over and thinking maybe he really shouldn't be a writer anymore. And he writes a wonderful letter to his friend Jonathan Franzen where he says, I just think I'm paraphrasing, the absolute need to be a writer is now gone. He in the end of his life, Wallace met somebody who he had a very successful relationship with, and they married. And so maybe that took off some of the, it's the old cliche about you don't necessarily write in the happiest times of your life. You don't necessarily write best in the happiest times of your life. And I think a piece of him probably no longer felt it was absolutely necessary to get it done. He had a lot of things to do. He taught at Pomona, enjoyed his teaching, and liked his life much more. And then you have this tragic end cap, like this thing that in a way we should not even be imagining could have happened, because it would be more, to me, it would be more expected that he would have wound up never finishing another novel, but actually growing old and teaching, and being irritated when people would ask him about Infinite Jest at conferences. And I could have seen more as an ending for him. This ending that he had is immensely sad.
Yeah.
Immensely sad.
I'm afraid that we're almost out of time, but I would like to ask you, what are you working on next as an active journalist with The New Yorker?
Sure. Well, I mean, I just had a piece this week in the New Yorker published about Sagrada Familia, which is the Gaudi cathedral. It's actually not a cathedral. The Gaudi Basilica, technically a minor basilica, but an amazing building worth seeing in Barcelona. I haven't done a biography since David, and I ask myself, why? Some have been proposed to me. I've proposed others. There was something really absolutely, I think, sui generis about him as a life to write, which is really, you're as the biographer. Imagine like you're like you have a very specific task. So he was not writing about David was not like writing the Pale King. You didn't have a boring person who you had to make interesting. In a way, you had somebody who was just bouncing around the cosmos, who you sort of had to slow down. So I've looked at other biographies. On a technical note, one of the things David did that was already anachronistic, but was incredibly important for me in Every Love Story is Ghost Stories. He wrote letters, and letters are oxygen to a biographer. The letters were amazing. And most people don't write letters anymore. So if I were to write about another person, would I be going through their emails, getting some tech support to try and hack open their old Yahoo account? I mean, probably. It's not a terrible fate, but none of those really pleased me. So really, since then, I did do a kind of a biography of Sondheim, who touched me in a similar way, but threw me out of the house. So I couldn't do a whole biography. It's more my literally, it's more my interviews with him. He was a very old man at the time. I enjoyed him and his music, immensely.
Yeah.
But it wasn't the same scale effort. It couldn't be. So that was a kind of biography, but I haven't done a full scale one. And I go to all these biographers conferences, and there are people who they do they do Emily Bronte, and they do Charlotte Bronte, and they do Jane Austen, and like they pick them off one after the other, and I'm just not that person. I think David was really a one-off, at least, never say never, but a one-off in this time frame for me, and somebody I was very glad to have had a chance to write on. There may be later biographies. I don't know if something's in the works, but I really do feel like it was fun to be in absolutely new territory. There are biographers who like to put a new gloss on existing information. I wasn't really that person. I liked that it was, you went to somebody's house and you asked to see the letters. That was really exciting for me. I was basically the aspirin papers, but my were for the wrong party.
Well, DT, this has been a great pleasure, and I personally have very much enjoyed this. Thank you for being a part of our program and for sharing your thoughts on your work, and thank you for writing it. It's an amazing book.
Thank you. Very kind of you guys.